Well, now we come to the 14th century. There we go, the 14th century, roughly the 1300s. From one way of thinking about it, we can call this time period the late Middle Ages. From the other angle, we can call it the early modern period, or at least the start of the early modern period. The 14th century is one of the hinges in the way we think about history, at least looking back at history. That's because it's a time of transition in Western culture, and you see the word transition there on the screen. You know what a transition is, the change from one thing to another thing. Well, we've been talking about one thing, and now we're going to start talking about the other thing. We've been talking about what we call the classical and medieval worlds, the ancient and medieval worlds. Now we're going to be turning our attention to the modern world. You may not catch that transition in this particular online session. In fact, you probably won't. But I think within a week or two you'll start to see that this really is a turning point in the culture. And so you'll be hearing, even in this online session, we talk about the late Middle Ages, the early modern period, the late medieval world, the early modern world, and it's the same time period. That's because we're in this time of transition, this time of change. Well, you may not see that in this particular online session, but I think within a week or two you will. Not only is it a time of radical transition in the culture, though, but it's also a time of trouble. There's an awful lot of bad things that hit Western Europe in the 14th century, roughly the 1300s. Excuse me, I've still got my allergy problem. I may even be sniffling a little bit during the presentation. If you hear me sniffling, then I apologize. I know it's rude to sniffle, but if you think about it, it'd probably be ruder if I didn't. I'm not sure you'd like to look at that image for a while. Anyway, back to our line of thought here. It's a time of trouble in the 14th century. There's an awful lot of bad stuff that happens in Western Europe in the 14th century. In a world history course, it would take us quite a bit of time to talk about all the bad things that happened in Western Europe in the 14th century. And at the top of everybody's list of bad things that happened in Western Europe in the 14th century is the outbreak of a disease, the plague. Bubonic plague, to be more precise than I think we really need to be, the plague. A disease which breaks out in Western Europe right in the middle of the 1300s. You may already know this. You probably do if you come to us from the health sciences, or maybe you've talked about this in a world history course or an American history course. But it's just the way that the world works, that people who live in a particular part of the world, people who live in a certain part of the world, and their descendants inherit certain immunities to certain diseases. In other words, people who live in one part of the world come into contact with diseases that aren't prevalent in other parts of the world. And because they live in parts of the world where these diseases are common, they develop an immunity to the disease, and when they pass on to their descendants inherit an immunity to diseases. And what that means is that diseases that are no big deal in some parts of the world can be devastating in other parts of the world. Because in one part of the world, people who've lived there for a while or whose ancestors lived there, they've developed an immunity to diseases. Here's what I'm talking about. Probably the most famous example of this occurrence for an American audience is the encounter of American Indians with European settlers. Europeans brought diseases that, if you happen to have European ancestry, are no big deal, like the common cold, chicken pox, measles, diseases which aren't a big deal if you happen to have European ancestry. But if you don't, as Native American peoples didn't, then those diseases can be devastating. And that's just the way the world works. Everybody has these inherited immunities. If you happen to have West African ancestry, then you probably have an inherited immunity to malaria. If you happen to have East African ancestry, you probably have an inherited immunity to cholera. It's just the way the world works. Well, bubonic plague, the disease that we're talking about here, is a East Asian disease. If you happen to have East Asian ancestry, you happen to have Korean, Chinese, Japanese ancestry, then bubonic plague is no big deal. You catch bubonic plague, you cough, and you feel kind of tired for a few days, but then you bounce back and you're doing just fine. Um, it's really not a big deal if you happen to have those inherited immunities. But if you don't have those inherited immunities, well, it can be devastating. There's an outbreak of the plague in where Burma is today, and I actually refuse to use the word Myanmar to refer to the place, for reasons which, if you know about Southeast Asia, then you know, and if not, don't worry about. But there's an outbreak of bubonic plague in Burma, right at the start of the 1300s. Oh, by the way, I know this map is really small. You can't read all the letters on it. Don't worry about it, okay? I'm just showing you the map here in general. Don't worry that it's kind of small there on your screen. Where the disease spreads into China by, the 1330s or so. There are outbreaks of bubonic plague across China. But we're still talking about people who have that inherited immunity, and so the disease is not that big a deal. The problem is that the disease begins to be transferred along the major trade routes, and that's what's indicated by the large red lines on the map there. Until eventually the disease makes it to Europe, where people do not have this inherited immunity. I'm showing you here a map which is similar to the one you have in your textbook. I should have this open, shouldn't I? There we go, page 52 in your textbook. On page 52 you have a map that shows the spread of bubonic plague across Western Europe in the 1300s. On the map on the screen, if you can make out the red lines on the map, that shows the spread of the disease at 6-month intervals to the north. And the same thing is being demonstrated in your textbook by the different colors on the map. Well, the disease begins to spread to the north. It breaks out in June of 1347, right in the middle of 1347, in a shipment of goods that came over from China, carried by land and then by water into Europe. The disease is actually carried by a certain type of flea that lives on a certain type of Chinese rat. And as the rats got out of the shipment, began spreading and reproducing, and more importantly for us, carrying this flea around, as the fleas would occasionally jump off the rats and bite people, that's how the disease was spread. And so actually you're looking at a map here of how quickly rats move, because the rats spread to the north, and as you see in whichever map you're able to look at, within 3 years the disease has covered Western Europe. And in that 3-year time period, about half the population has died from the disease. Yeah. That's one of those little facts that half the population of Europe dies from the disease in 3 years. Then you sit back, wait a second, wow. In 3 years, half the population of an entire continent is dead from the disease. I'm not sure there's anything else like it in world history. Half the continent is dead in 3 years from the disease. I mean, that's mind-boggling. That's not counting all the people who die of heart attacks and accidents and old age and everything else. But that 3-year time period applies to the continent. On the ground, it's even more devastating. When the disease gets to your town, you've got about a week. And at the end of a week, you'll know whether you're in the half who are going to live or the half who are going to die, because you're either dead or you are recovering from the disease, or for whatever reason you managed to escape being infected by it. Imagine living in a town where half the population is dead in a week. And then the horror isn't over. You have to go house to house. Today we'd have to go car by car getting rid of the dead bodies, because if you don't get rid of the dead bodies, then you have all kinds of other problems. You might survive bubonic plague and then die of dysentery the week later because you didn't take care of your neighbor's dead body. Well, pretty heavy stuff. And in a world history course, we'd be talking about bubonic plague, or the Black Death. You may be able to make it out. That's what it's called on the map there. That's what Europeans called bubonic plague. The disease affects the body in a number of different ways, but one way that the disease affects the body is by getting into the meat of the body, the flesh of the body, and it just causes the meat of the body to liquefy and just immediately rot. It breaks down the cell walls, and Well, for Europeans with fair skin, when they saw the pooling, rotten meat juice underneath their skin, it's nasty. It's a nasty disease. When those black splotches showed up on the skin, well, there's no recovery from that disease. When the walls of the cells of your body begin to liquefy, um, well, it's a horrifying disease. In a world history course, we would spend a great deal of time talking about bubonic plague, especially with more recent concerns over bioterrorism and what happens if a disease gets loose with a 50% kill ratio. And thinking about our map here, it certainly wouldn't take 3 years to cover a continent. Today, with interstate systems and air travel, be 12 hours to cover a continent. And to think about half the population, say, of North America dying in a week, well, that's pretty heavy. And if you're looking for there's really no test case out there other than bubonic plague in Europe in the 14th century. If you're looking for economic data and letters and diaries of people going through the experience and looking at sociological and psychological effects and that kind of thing, with a massive outbreak of disease like this, well, bubonic plague is your best test case. Just so you know, you don't have to worry about bubonic plague anymore. Bubonic plague is a bacterial disease, and if you come to us from the health sciences, then you know that all you need is a shot of penicillin or a couple of Cipro tablets and knocks down bubonic plague pretty fast. So you don't have to worry about bubonic plague anymore. It breaks out every once in a while, but it's not a big deal. You don't have to worry about bubonic plague. There's other stuff out there in the world you should be worried about. There's stuff out there that should have you scared to death, but not bubonic plague. There's your good news for today. You don't have to worry about bubonic plague. Plenty of other stuff out there to worry about, but, well, the less said about that, the better. At least for today. But that's on the map, okay, of bad things happening in Western Europe in the 14th century. Not only is it a time of disease, it's a time of almost constant warfare. The most significant of these wars, nearly all the nations of Europe go to war at some point during the 14th century, but the most significant of these wars, a war called the 100 Years' War, which gives you some indication of how long the war lasts. It actually lasts for a little over 130 years, I think 136 years, around in there. Today we expect wars to be over in a week or two so that we can get back to the regular TV schedule. But in real life, wars tend to take a long time to work themselves out, and the 100 Years' War was a war fought between England and France. At that time, England included what you and I would think of as about half of where France is today. And it's a war fought over that territory that now is considered a part of France. Obviously, you figure out who won the war. France won the war. But, in a world history course, we'd be talking about some of the big events of the 100 Years' War. If you're into military history, you might recognize names like Henry V and the Battle of Agincourt and Joan of Arc and some of the big military events of the 100 Years' War that we don't go into here in this course. In this course, we just notice that the war takes place. That means more death, devastation, economic disruption, disrupted family lives, and so on. Not only is it a time of almost constant warfare, but it's also a time of famine. It's a time of hunger. As you know, the world's climate goes through cycles of changes, and the 14th century was a very dry time in Western Europe. There's a number of droughts that stretch across a century, some of them lasting 4 or 5 years at a time where there's just not much rain. That means it's hard to grow crops to eat. It's hard to grow crops to feed your animals, that you can eat your animals. Animals who live in the woods have trouble finding food, and so that there aren't as many of them as there used to be. And so hunting doesn't supplement your family's food budget as it ordinarily might. What's a time of hunger? Now, nobody's starving to death. Starving to death takes an awful lot of work. Americans in particular misuse this phrase, starving to death. If it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon, you haven't had lunch yet, you're starving to death. In real life, starving to death takes an awful lot of work. Unless you are suffering from severe mental health issues, of very devastating mental health issues. Or something really weird happens to you, like you end up on a desert island or you fall down a mine shaft or something. Excuse me. Starving to death is going to take an awful lot of work. Now, there are people in the world who are starving to death, but that's not most Americans. I mean, take a look around. Now, there are people in the world who are starving to death. I can tell you why that's the case, though. Their own governments are keeping food away from them. And I've spent time in East Africa, and I know what I'm talking about here. There are places in the world where there's plenty of food, and a mile or two away, people are starving to death. That's because their own governments are keeping food away from them. Every couple of years we hear about famine in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is beautiful farmland. It's got plenty of water. Where do you think all the water in the Nile River comes from? It comes out of Ethiopia. It's got plenty of water. It's got beautiful farmland. But occasionally the government picks on certain groups of people, and those people don't get food. Well, enough of this discussion, too. Well, it's a time of a lot of hunger. Now, nobody, like I said, is starving to death, but malnutrition is a different story. And I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, that kids need the right kind of food as they grow up, or they have all kinds of problems. Stunted mental development, stunted physical development. And you see, what you have are, cohorts of kids who, as they go through times of their lives, there's just a lot of food. And so as those kids grow up and they have their own children, their stunted mental development and physical development affects how they can provide for their own families. Well, man, there's an awful lot of bad stuff going on in the 14th century. I need some vodka in my coffee just to deal with it. I don't actually have vodka in the coffee, okay? But, man, this is heavy stuff. Plague, disease, war, famine, oh man. Well, enough of the bad stuff. What's interesting about the 14th century is that in the midst of all this chaos and catastrophe and calamity, it's also a time of creativity. We're going to see a group of people living in Western Europe in the 14th century who are going to try to do something which hasn't been done in this part of the world for a very long time. They're going to try to reinvent and recreate something that we haven't seen in this part of the world for a very long time. We're going to take a look at that in the next session.